The Tsunami Quilt, Grandfather's Story, by Anthony D. Fredericks. When I was little, my grandfather and I went everywhere, always sharing stories and discovering new places. We were the best of friends. Each year in the spring, Grandmother would make a beautiful lei of plumera blossoms. She would give it to Grandfather, placing it gently around his neck. Afterwards, he and I would drive to Lexile Point. He'd ease his old car down the twisting road to the peninsula and park in the grass near the small cove. Then Grandfather and I would walk along the ocean's edge. We would hold hands and watch the sun dance across the waves. We never talked much on this yearly visit. Somehow I knew it was a time and place for quiet thoughts. Grandfather always stopped at the marble monument beside the ocean. He would let go of my hand and slowly walk up the stone steps. He would take the lei from around his neck and place it on top of the monument. In silence, he would rest a weathered hand on the stone and stare out over the waves. He would stand there for a long time, watching the surf roll in. Grandfather had been a fisherman all his life. He told me stories of the sea and ancient Hawaiian legends. Every weekend, he and the other fishermen would gather to talk story about the ocean. Sometimes I got to listen. The April visit to Lexile was the only time I ever saw him so quiet. When you are older, Kimu, I will tell you the story of this sacred place, Grandfather promised each year. You'll learn why it's both a place of tragedy and a place of remembrance. For now, know that the ocean is both friend and foe. It gives, but it also takes. In those days, my family lived in a small house on the Humkara coast on the Big Island of Hawaii. My father was a teacher and my mother was a volunteer at the local school. When my sisters and I weren't at school, we caught fish or swam in the nearby stream. As a family, we laughed and played and took many trips together, and Grandfather and I were the best of friends. Then one day, my grandfather was gone. The doctor said it was a heart attack. My father said it was a broken heart. It was just after my 9th birthday, and I cried for a long time. Suddenly, I felt all alone. I didn't understand. Several days later, I went to my father. Tell me the story of Lexile, I pleaded. My father looked deep into my eyes. There was a sadness in his face as he spoke in a quiet voice. I guess you are old enough to know, he began. Your grandfather will want it so. Many years ago, long before you were born, the school was down on the peninsula. The teachers' cottages were along the shore, and all the classroom buildings were arranged around the great spread of a banyan tree. One April morning, the rising sun sparkled on the water as it had for thousands of years. As usual, many students came to school early and gathered along the shore. Others were playing on the baseball field. More students were still arriving by bus or walking along the road that snakes down from the cliffs. Was Grandfather one of those students? I asked. Yes. On this morning, he sat in the rear of the bus with his younger brother. As the bus rounded and turned in the road, some of the students in the front shouted, "There's no water in the ocean." At first, your grandfather thought it was just a joke. But then they repeated even louder than before, "There's no water in the ocean." Your grandfather stood up and looked. He saw that the sea had receded, far beyond the jagged rocks that encircled the tiny peninsula. As soon as the bus stopped, everyone hurried out onto the road and down to the cove, except your grandfather. Maybe he just had a strange feeling. Many students, including Grandfather's younger brother, ran down to the shore. They wanted to see this strange occurrence. Your grandfather watched from a high grassy area some distance behind the wall. Then what happened, I asked. Without warning, the sea began to swell. Water rose up the shore and onto the road, not in a towering wave, but rather as a powerful surge. It caught everyone by surprise. No one could believe what they were seeing. The ocean receded and then rose up again. As before, a wall of water cascaded up the landscape, even higher than before. Some students, including Grandfather, ran further away from the ocean. Others stayed near the shoreline to see what would happen next. The second wave retreated. Then students saw the most terrifying sight of all. It was an enormous wall of water as high as the lighthouse on the point. Suddenly, everyone knew it was the third wave of a tsunami. Was Grandfather scared? I asked. Yes, he was, because this wave was dangerous and more powerful than the first two. The wave rushed in from all sides of the tiny peninsula. The ocean churned everywhere like an enormous pot of boiling water. Water crushed through the cottages. The buildings were crushed and the wreckage swept out to sea. Boards, branches, and debris was scattered across the peninsula. The wave rose to the height of the coconut trees, smashing everything in its way. Teachers and students were swept off their feet and out into the ocean. People were scrambling everywhere, frightened and confused. Everyone was trying to escape. What did Grandfather do? I asked. Your grandfather ran up the road to the cliffs with all the power in his legs. He stopped and turned to see people tossed around like dolls. He stared as classmates were sucked into the ocean and beyond the shoreline. He heard their cries and screams. Did many people die? Father looked at me and reached out to hold my hand. Yes, Kimu, the tsunami waves were terrible. The third wave rose more than 30 feet above sea level. It was everywhere. In the end, 24 students and teachers were killed. Is that the reason for the marble monument by the cove? I asked. Yes. On that monument are etched the names and ages of the children and teachers who lost their lives that day. So that is why Grandfather and I visit Lalibweowe each year. Yes, Kimu, but there is something more you must know. My father took me outside. We climbed into his car and headed east towards Hilo. Shortly after crossing the Waligu River, he turned the car and parked it near a large stone building. As we walked through the door, I read the sign, Pacific Tsunami Museum. Father held my hand tightly as we wound our way through the different exhibits and displays. We stopped in front of a large quilt hanging on the wall. The quilt was in bright colors of blue and yellow. I counted 24 squares around the border of the quilt. There was a small wave and a person's name inside each square. The center of the quilt was an image of a large tsunami wave. Next to the quilt was a sign. I slowly read it out loud. Students donate quilt to Tsunami Museum out of respect for those who lost their lives at Lalibweowe Point during the April 1st, 1946 tsunami. Students from Lalibweowe Elementary and High School finished this special quilt. The quilt commemorates the 24 students and school faculty who lost their lives at Lalibweowe Point during the morning of April 1st, 1946. The colors of the quilt represent the school colors, blue and gold. On December 19th, 1997, the quilt was donated to the Pacific Tsunami Museum. In memory of those who lost their lives in the 1946 tsunami at Lalibweowe Point. I watched as Father reached out and gently touched one of the squares. This is your great uncle's, he said. I looked at him puzzled. Your grandfather's younger brother was one of the children swept away by the tsunami that day. Grandfather watched as he was carried out to the sea by the third wave. There was nothing he could do. He was frightened and helpless. His brother was your age, 9 years old, when he died. He said, Grandfather felt all alone. He learned to forgive, but he never forgot. I stared at the quilt and my eyes began to fill with tears. Now I understood. The next day was April 1st. My grandmother made a beautiful lei of plumera blossoms and placed it gently around my neck. I rode with my father to Lalawai. He eased the car down the winding road to the peninsula, and we parked in the grass near the small cove. In silence, I walked over to the marble monument and up the stone steps. I removed the lei from around my neck and gently placed it on top of the monument. As I did, I heard my grandfather's voice. The ocean is both friend and foe. It gives, but it also takes. I looked up and watched the gentle surf rolling in from the sea. Then Father and I stood together and watched the sun dance across the waves.